Funding for this program is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
But if we were to solve a $2 billion problem with tax increases, that would come out to almost $500 per person in Minnesota. I don't think that's what the public wants.
Governor, first, I'd like to get your reaction to at least what we know about the DFL budget blueprint, as it's called.
Well, hang on to your wallet. It's that time of the year.
Minnesota 2000 is a new program that we are implementing to encourage communities to take a stake in their local schools.
We will open the doors of opportunities so they can have the same kinds of opportunities that you and I had. We have proven that we can rise above the gridlock, and we will do it again. We must find the direct route to change and improvement in order to address the challenges that lie ahead.
Democrats in the Minnesota legislature are preparing to launch an attack on Governor Arne Carlson for what they are calling a pattern of flip-flops, deceits, and bald-faced lies.
I use my vetoes to reduce the growth of spending so too much every single unit of government.
Today, Minnesota is back on track, and we're charging ahead with vigor, precisely because our times demand that we break with old conventions, that we alter old habits, and we revise old ways of doing business. I know there are times when we present to the people of Minnesota a sense of contention and debate and disagreement. But clearly, that is precisely the essence of what democracy is about.
In the maroon and gold, star player for the state of Minnesota, Governor Arne Carlson.
Hey, Governor. Good. You know, it's been 25 years since you were elected governor. Welcome to the spotlight again here in Williams Arena. Let's have a conversation.
I'm glad you did it at the barn. That's wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, Governor, it's just really great to reconnect with you after all these years. I think it's been 16 years now since you left office, 25 years since you were elected. And of course, you and I sometimes had an adversarial relationship, but it was healthy, I think. When I was the reporter for the Star Tribune and I covered you, I like to liken myself to have been to a referee who was covering the dominant player in Minnesota politics at Center Court for many years. And so it's great to be back here at Center Court with you and for a conversation on your legacy.
Delighted, thank you.
You've got your University of Minnesota sweater on.
Right.
Everybody who knows you knows of your abiding passion in this university, passion for this university. Huge Gopher basketball fan, used to sit right over there.
Correct.
Talk a little bit about how important this institution in particular is for Minnesota. It's one of the largest urban universities in the nation, of course. It always seems to be involved in some sort of controversy, perhaps to be expected from any institution this large and powerful and important.
You said something I thought was very important, and that is that there's always a controversy. When those controversies stop, that's the time to worry, because then you've declined. The reason you have controversies is because people love it. I think the relationship between a governor and the university has to be close. But that's not to say that you can't improve the management system, and I'd really like to see that happen.
Governor Arne Carlson is always game for a charged-up debate. His philosophies about society and life were forged at a very young age.
Born in 1934 in the Bronx, Arne Helga Carlson was the second of three sons for Swedish immigrants Helga and Kirsten Carlson. As with many immigrants at the time, his parents struggled to provide for their family.
First of all, we were very poor. We grew up in the Bronx of New York. I remember as a little kid we lived for a while in a one-room tar paper shack with one water pipe coming up, and that I think was the extent of our utilities. The good news was that everybody else was poor. So you didn't know it. You just thought that's the way life was. The highlight of our life was my father got a job as a superintendent of one of those high-class buildings. But I think what was important about those years was, one, being poor means not only that you don't have money, but it also means you don't have access to any form of power.
Despite their poverty, his father continued to give back to others by volunteering at their church, and that proved to be a life-changing connection for Arne.
And Papa was wonderful in the church, and he used to have a little boys club and take boys around on weekends to see various pieces of New York City. And one of the things he did was get us into a camp for so-called underprivileged children. And one of those camps was sponsored by the Choate School. And the counselors apparently got together, and somehow a scholarship was arranged, and so I was allowed to go to Choate.
He went on to Williams College and then came to the University of Minnesota, where he received a graduate degree in history. It was here in Minnesota that he found acceptance and opportunity. His early political experience was with the Democratic Party, working on Senator Hubert H. Humphrey's presidential campaign. Later on, his admiration for Governor Elmer Anderson led him to the Republican Party. He was more comfortable with the balanced priorities of human compassion paired with frugal government spending. Public service seemed to suit him well. In 1970, he was elected to the Minnesota State Legislature, where he quickly rose to minority whip. He was also gaining a reputation, or some would say notoriety, for being a strong debater. In a few short years, he turned his attention to statewide office. He won the auditor's seat in 1978. It was here that Arne Carlson cemented his financial management credentials. By the late 1980s, he was eyeing the governor's office and was often overheard by colleagues saying, "If I were governor." This despite the fact that Minnesota had long been known as a deep blue state, dominated by Democrats, the folks he'd left several years earlier.
Less well known is that Minnesota has had a strong Republican Party, and the conservative wing of that Republican Party was in the ascendance, becoming more powerful beginning in the 1980s. By the time 1990 rolls around, the conservative wing of the Republican Party, what today we might describe as kind of a Tea Party or libertarian, or in Minnesota, a quite powerful social conservative element, had taken control of the party.
With the likes of influential players like Wheelock Whitney backing him, candidate Carlson seemed to be attracting the right people under his tent.
The year that Arne decided to run for governor, I knew Arne the best, and he said that he was leaning toward running in the primary. He was much better known than any of the other candidates. The night of the primary, I gave a dinner party to celebrate his victory before we heard the vote count. And much to our horror, a funny thing happened on the way to winning the primary. Arne carried one county out of 87. One county.
The best Arne Carlson could do was carry Goodhue County, the home of his lieutenant governor candidate, Joan L. Deerstead.
We were crushed, absolutely crushed. It took us completely by surprise, and we really kind of put our tail between our legs and tried to blame somebody, but we just read the tea leaves wrong.
But he didn't have much time to contemplate the thrashing he took at the polls. Through one of the most bizarre series of events ever in state politics, Carlson jumped back into the race less than 3 weeks before Election Day.
The party's nominee, named Grunseth, was caught up in a scandal involving skinny dipping and teenage girls, including his teenage stepdaughter.
John Grunseth, the Republican-endorsed candidate, was suddenly splashed across state headlines alleging improprieties.
I was talking to Arne. I urged him to put his hat in the ring immediately and contest to be the candidate.
John Grunseth withdrew a mere 10 days before the election.
And his candidacy blew up, and Arne Carlson, who had come in second, then moved into the spot of Republican nominee, but he was clearly, literally the second choice.
And then the Supreme Court came along and said that Arne would be the candidate because he won the next most votes in the primary to Grunseth. So he officially became the candidate.
And so we had some concerns about that as Democrats, but certainly wanted Grunseth to stay the course and be the person who would be running against Rudy. But we thought the chances of Perpich losing had increased substantially with the ruling.
The bottom line here is that Arne Carlson was an accidental candidate in the 1990 gubernatorial race. He was really off on the side. He'd been defeated. He had been marginalized within his own party.
And it was just a whirlwind election, the shortest election for governor in the history of the state. And Arne defeated Rudy Perpich. And it was one of the great thrills.
That roller coaster thrill ride quickly transitioned into the streets of reality. Minnesota was facing a massive budget shortfall of $2.3 billion. A team had to be assembled in record time, and the legislature, well, they were ready to meet this accidental victor head on.
From an historical perspective, I think we have to realize in 1991, when I came into office, I probably had the lowest approval ratings of any governor.
That's
certainly
true, I remember that.
Yeah.
I present to you the Governor of the state of Minnesota, Arne Carlson.
Safe to say, with approval ratings in the low 30s, Governor Carlson started with some room for improvement.
It seemed that any mistake that could be made, we made it. We were surprisingly awkward when I look back on how awkward we were.
But I do think the people of Minnesota have a very clear expectation of what they want out of us and what they want out of their government. I think they understand that we have a serious financial crisis.
And we let everybody else define who we were and where we were going, as opposed to taking the reins of government like a Theodore Roosevelt and saying, no, this is going to be the direction, and bully, bully, bully.
Now, when we started with a $2 billion problem.
It was his family who provided some perspective on the monumental task at hand.
My brother talking to me and making me understand that it was kind of like Bobby to Jack Kennedy. And that was, you are the governor, and you've got to be the governor, and not allow others to control you, but you control them. And I thought that was very helpful.
We're going on a diet.
In tough times, tough decisions must be made. It became quite clear that he had to shake up his staff.
I remembered the evening that I was going to do it. I walked outside the governor's residence and saw my grave, and on the tombstone was engraved, "Here lies a failed governor." I mean, that was probably the lowest point ever. And then I remember shortly thereafter, as we were starting to redirect, Wheelock Whitney came into a breakfast meeting and gave me a big hug. He never said a word, not a word. He didn't say hi or hello or anything else, but he saw my face and he just gave me a hug. And that really said everything, because all these people had worked so hard, had put so much of their confidence in me, and now it was up to me to, in fact, become the governor.
He is a man of his convictions. He has a very strong independent streak in him, and yes, things were very cloudy for him right in the beginning, and it just took a man of his personality, his conviction, his strong belief in himself and his belief in Minnesota to ride out that storm, and he did it.
But if we were to solve a $2 billion problem with tax increases, that would come out to almost $500 per person in Minnesota. I don't think that's what the public wants.
And from that point on, we really started to govern. And I think the first big victory was health care.
Change, real change, cannot happen overnight. This budget is only the beginning. We need to set our individual self-interests aside and ask one question. What can we do that will make things better for all Minnesotans in the century ahead?
It wasn't an easy victory, that is for sure. But his determination to make a move on health care was personal.
My younger brother Lars got appendicitis, and he must have been about 3 years old at the time. And he was rushed to Fordham Hospital, and the doctor wouldn't operate until we came up with some money. And here was poor Mama. We were destitute, no money, and the doctor demanding money. And by 7 o'clock that night, his appendix burst. And the story I'm told, and I think it's a very true story, is Mama, who, you talk about being feisty, I'm modest compared to her. Apparently she was just 4'10". Apparently she went to the doctor and said, if my son dies, you're going to die too.
In 1991, the Democratic-controlled state legislature passed a bill that would have provided universal health care coverage by 1997. But it came with a price tag of $500 million and no plan to fund
Governor
it.
Arne Carlson outside the mansion. Governor, first, I'd like to get your reaction to at least what we know about the DFL budget blueprint, as it's called.
Well, hang on to your wallet. It's that time of the year.
In light of that massive budget shortfall, Governor Carlson was faced with a grueling choice.
I vetoed the bill, and thousands of demonstrators magically appeared all over the Capitol, well orchestrated, by the way, and calling me every name in the book.
In the last 3 months, there's been an awful lot of criticism of our budget, and now we're told that we're going to have a $201 million tax increase, but we're not told from where.
The legislators who'd been involved in the bill were extremely angry about it. The press, some of them at least, were on the side of the legislature in the battle, and that he was just leaving those who couldn't afford health care high and dry without health care.
But you know what? It brought out my feistiness, which was something that had been reasonably latent. Now it was coming back. And I remember calling up Marlene Marshall, who was our commissioner of health, and I said, we're going to do a modest plan on health care. And I laid out just several philosophical expectations, cost containment, quality, all of that. And she went to work. And she and Mary Jo O'Brien, her assistant, did a marvelous job. They very quietly met politically with Democrats, Republicans, but more with the industry itself.
It was an effort to say, hey, look, we've got Medicaid program for the indigent, the really poor, but we need something for the near poor. And working with Democrats in the legislature, built a program called MinCare, which provides support for folks who are between the two. And they created a fund that used a tax on healthcare providers to pay for it. Doesn't sound very Republican, does it, in today's terms? And it really irritated a good number of Republicans as kind of big government liberalism. But for Carlson, he was very pragmatic.
We have proven that we can rise above the gridlock, and we will do it again. We must find the direct route to change and improvements in order to address the challenges that lie ahead.
My recollection is they came back with a smaller plan. It was to be a demonstration kind of a model, and it contained all the key points that I wanted, and it was superb.
As much as the healthcare initiative brought out the feistiness in Governor Carlson, it also tested his consensus building. It took shape as the Gang of Seven.
It was a bipartisan group of people who had common goals, not necessarily how to achieve the goals when they started out, but certainly they wanted all to find health care that was affordable, that was available, and that had some cost containment measures involved with it. So they started meeting, and they met in secret, which, in my opinion, is probably the only way to accomplish a controversial goal of that sort. And I think I commend him for the hands-off approach.
She called up, and the bill was on the House floor, and I was having real trouble getting Republican votes. And she called up and she said, you know, I'm going to scuttle a bill if you can't get some more Republican votes up. And I said, Dee, I'll do my best to get some Republican votes up, and I know you want to embarrass me, but not on this bill, if you will. And she agreed.
So we were 6 votes shy, and I didn't see a lot of those votes coming from the DFL side. So I called the governor, and I said, Governor, can you send some of your aides up to the floor? And so not only did he send some folks up to talk to some of the Republicans who weren't at that point voting for the bill, but he also personally, I believe, called some of the Republicans on the floor. The board was locked for over an hour, and a lot of buzzing going on the floor. And we finally marshaled another 8 votes. So the bill passed with 2 votes to spare.
And yes, we got some more Republican votes up, but she was the one who put it over. And, you know, think now, after all these years, she can look back and identify the key role that she played in doing it. No, it was marvelous. From there on in, we were cooking on all front burners, and our work with the legislature really started to take off very, very well.
3 years ago, when I delivered my first State of the State message, Minnesota was headed in the wrong direction. Our administration inherited an immediate $200 million budget shortfall, and we faced a $1.8 billion projected gap between spending and revenue. Today, 3 years later, we are looking at a projected surplus of almost $430 million.
The healthcare debate was a proving ground for his leadership. In the years to come, it would be tested again and again and again. His ability to govern grew in many forms, but probably the most visible was his veto pen.
Well, the state needed someone who could say no, and had the guts to stand up and really be able to say no, not only to Democrats, but to constituency groups and to some of his fellow Republicans.
Democrats in the Minnesota legislature are preparing to launch an attack on Governor Arne Carlson for what they are calling a pattern of flip-flops, deceits, and bald-faced lies.
As Governor Carlson prepares to sell his budget, Democratic leaders are putting the finishing touches on what they call a Carlson file, stopping just short of calling him a liar.
There is a serious case here, serious questions of credibility with the governor.
Governor Carlson was a strong, fiery executive, and he used his words and the bully pulpit of the governor's office to drive an agenda.
The Carlson file also includes a very public promise to restore a state employee pay freeze, a promise the governor now says he's decided not to keep.
We're going on a diet.
We understand there may be some bad news. We understand that we're going to be asked to sacrifice. Be fair, be straightforward, be honest with us.
Governor Carlson set the record for the most number of vetoes. So he saw the veto as a way to compel the legislature to follow the Carlson agenda and not be drawn into being a clerk merely for the legislature enacting what they wanted.
There was a fairly contentious period during that time with a lot of gubernatorial vetoes. We reacted quite angrily to them. We used to think that he rather liked vetoing.
That was part of that determination to make things work the way they should work. And if the legislature was going to pass kind of expanding legislation or get us off on a track away from kind of the central theme of governing, it wasn't going to happen. And they knew it wasn't an idle threat.
Well, I think we were more likely to consult with the governor's staff, with the commissioners at whatever level, and find out what was acceptable.
I think he was also very ably assisted by the Republicans in the House who upheld his vetoes. And they were, that was a triumph, because not all of those Republicans liked the kind of Republican that Arne Carlson was. But Steve Swigum, who was the minority leader, was determined that a Republican governor was not going to get overridden thanks to a Republican that wasn't going to support him. And he rallied those troops.
I would call on Representative Swigum to show some leadership on the issue, to join with us. His concern certainly ought to be as much for the roads and bridges in rural Minnesota as mine is, and yet he appears to totally disregard the needs out there.
By the end of his second term, Governor Carlson had vetoed 238 pieces of legislation.
Now, in the process, we quickly became the target of nearly every entrenched and powerful spending system in Minnesota. And as we were being attacked by all the forces that resist change, it was then that we knew we were doing something right.
And we needed that at that time. We needed to right the ship, and we didn't need to continue to go from pillar to post with the finance issues.
It's no secret that Governor Carlson was invigorated by his battles. He relished opportunities to fight, regardless of whether it was with the legislature or his own staff.
What he wanted was a good fight. He wanted you to interact with him. And if you didn't interact with him, then he didn't care about that. He wanted a good discussion about what was going on. And so the interaction was part of what went on. And, Cindy was a major part of that as well, and so was I.
I guess the one thing that should come across there is that he had this intensity, and it was often, it overshadowed likability, and that's tough for a politician. You have to be likable. And what he managed to do was turn that intensity into an asset. And I think he proved, probably more than any other politician that I have seen recently, that a governor is very important to the people of the state. Particularly Minnesotans, they know their governor, they trust their governor.
Today, Minnesota is back on track, and we're charging ahead with vigor. We can all take pride in the fact that Financial World magazine just ranked Minnesota the third best financially managed state in America, and we have regained the AAA bond rating.
And it was something that I think he managed to communicate to people, that despite the sternness and despite the, the green eye shade demeanor of the accountant always checking the numbers, that he was there to help people as much as he was there in a paternal role. A very good example of this was during the campaign. During the 1994 re-election campaign, the John Marty campaign ran an ad, and it was kind of an animated spoof. It was called "That Darn Arnie."
taxes and then raise the ones we've got. It's that darn Arnie who takes the rich folks' money and then thanks them all a lot. It's that darn Arnie who says that our schools are just fine, fine, fine as he laughs and hands the kids another beat alive. It's that darn Arnie, that darn Arnie.
Well, you know, most people, they liked Arnie so much, they thought, yep, that darn Arnie. They thought it was his ad.
You said you were going to be the education governor, but after you vetoed so many dollars for higher education, after you froze the education funding formula, I think people are beginning to wonder when education gets its priorities. Education is going to be the highest priority of mine.
I wouldn't say he was Teflon, but he really was, you know, even a barb at him. And I think the Marty campaign realized this guy is running around with a 65% approval rating. I mean, how many shots can you take at him?
He had gone from a rating in the low 30s to the mid-60s, illustrating the public's confidence in his leadership.
Arnie was a fiscal conservative. He wanted to know where the dollars were and where they're going, and was pretty tight-fisted about that in most cases. But he was a pretty moderate, and some, I suppose, Republicans would say liberal on issues. But I always go back, or when I think about this, I go back to the gay rights legislation. And he was down in Worthington, and someone really was ragging on him about it from the audience. And he said, look, he said, you know, if it was my son or daughter who was gay or lesbian, I'd want to be sure that they had the same opportunities your son and daughter has.
Well, if the question is, where did my feelings come from? They really came again from Mom and Papa. I think oftentimes immigrants understand the American dream a lot better than those of us who were born and raised here. And they were extraordinarily firm believers that God created us all equal, and they truly meant it. And Papa particularly was a fierce fighter for the underdog. He really loved that part of the American culture. But he also demonstrated that you've got to fight for these things. And so, to me, it was just natural to, when you have the opportunity and you've got the power, use it for the benefit of all those groups that feel left out.
Tonight, I have outlined in the State of the State new job creation opportunities that will allow us to continue to outpace national growth. New partnerships that will link our great universities with the Mayo Clinic and the private sector. Unprecedented access to computers for all of our children, and a prevention program that is second to none. These are not concerns that are either Republican or Democrat, and they cannot be defined or measured according to the normal political slide rule. The fact is, we recognize change, and we want to harness that change for the betterment of all people.
And fight he did. He passed basic anti-discrimination laws and moved on to advocate for the environment.
So I'd like to see the United States play a global leadership role in terms of coming to grips with what has to be done and what sacrifices have to be made. And we can no longer afford the luxury of a debate of jobs versus environment, and therefore one is evil and you've got to push jobs at all costs. Jobs and environment are extremely compatible.
Lakes and streams and fields are an important part of who we are here in Minnesota, and he wanted it to be right for the people.
While Carlson had a reputation as a hard-nosed negotiator, he also had a knack for convincing unlikely partners to agree and reach common ground for the common good.
He put together coalitions in Minnesota that were really striking. On environmental issues, he went up and got the snowmobilers and the outdoor folks and linked them up with the more moderate, even democratic environmentalists. He had to do that because unlike our Democratic or Republican governors who had preceded and followed Governor Carlson, Governor Carlson could not count on a block of his own party to follow him. That was a real forte of Governor Carlson. We saw him also do that in education, where he was very adept at tapping into both Democratic bases of support, but also reaching out to Republicans who saw value in education and wanted to make sure that the funding formula would benefit their school districts.
And what we're saying here tonight in no uncertain terms is that we're not going to measure education in the context of fun, but we're going to measure education in the context of results and productivity. And this is a partnership that we're forming. We, the state, we, the people, we, the families of this state, are willing to provide resources and access to resources so that those children can have the opportunity to achieve high levels of learning.
He was one of the very early pioneers in trying to make a difference in how young people are educated in Minnesota.
And I can assure you that this budget, which reflects the needs of our children, will be my #1 priority this session, and I will do everything in my power to protect spending from being cut for our children.
Carlson's beliefs on education reach all the way back to his mother.
Mama was a strong believer in education. She understood that the essence of the American dream was education. I can tell you this without getting overly sentimental. Had it not been for my parents and for their belief in education and to Choate, I don't know what would have happened.
His ideas for educational reform were considered quite progressive at the time.
He was so convinced he wanted to do this for the kids of the state that it transcended politics.
We must also recognize that government alone will never be good at rearing children. Every sector of the community must play a role. Parents especially must take an active role. There's only one place where children can learn that they are lovable, that they are capable human beings, and that is at home.
The first term, Arne was really frustrated about education because we didn't have money to do things. But he wanted to improve education dramatically. And I think the voucher debate and discussion was partly a wake-up call to education that, hey, we're going to do something to change the dynamic here.
No more micromanagement. No more state regulations about how many hours of French or geography a student shall take. And no more piling on our teachers every social goal that should be delivered by families, churches, and other institutions.
There was a little piece of legislation in tax law that allowed for some education expenses to be taken as a deduction. We looked at that and said, why don't we make that a credit and put that in, we put that into the voucher debate. That gave us a vehicle to get those things done, and that's how we got there.
There is nothing greater that we can do for the future than to simply say to our children, we love you, we care about you, and we're going to do everything in our power to give you the opportunity to succeed. We do that, and I guarantee you Minnesota will emerge as the #1 state in the United States. We need your help. We need to forge a bipartisan alliance to do it in the name of our children. Thank you ever so much.
Well, I think Arne believed that the business community thought that our education system was working better than it was, and he disagreed with the business community and felt that our system could be a lot better.
Although make no bones about it, this is a Republican issue. This is not, school choice is not something Democrats generally embrace. But it did lead to changes, slow changes. It led to more charter schools. It led to an awareness that kids had to have opportunity.
If you look at Arne, where did Arne come from? He came from a very poor neighborhood in New York City, and he gets to go to Choate, and he gets to go to Williams, and he gets probably one of the best educations that the United States can offer.
With choice, we not only get more freedom, we get more competition. And we want to promote competition between schools. The truth is that competition spurs excellence. Competition keeps the focus on outcomes.
And every morning he's got to look up, get up and look in the mirror and say, I got that. Why can't somebody else get that?
If we want America to win, if we want Minnesota to win, I'll tell you the only way we're going to get it is by instituting change in our educational system.
And I think that's a lot of where his desire for that, for education comes from. It's in him.
Regardless of which policy initiative he pursued, it had to be solvent. His fiscal responsibility was unwavering. Everything had to be paid for, without any tails, as he called it. Cap the spending.
Tails were the spending tails, that when you enact a piece of legislation and you don't cap it in some way, you know, spending is going to increase with inflation and with other factors further on. So his point was, watch out for the spending tails.
And that we wanted an overall cost containment of our budgetary growth. This budget reflects that commitment. As I said before, the overall growth in this budget is less than 2% per year, and there isn't a single person in this House that can recall the last day that was accomplished. This budget is not designed for any one sector of our economy. This budget is driven by a tremendous desire to make Minnesota competitive with other states.
Well, I think part of it is that he was making the appeal to the taxpayers of the state. And he basically said, I think somebody's got to worry about you. Somebody's got to worry about how much you're paying. And I think we can do this. I think we can run state government effectively and efficiently and not raise taxes.
Carlson positioned the state of Minnesota to benefit from that booming economy that started to take off during his first term in office.
This is the first budget that truly deals with structural changes in how we spend our money. It's not full of gimmicks. It's not full of temporary shifts that can get us over a temporary problem. It's one that is genuinely designed on the long-term basis to reduce the anticipated growth of governmental costs.
We've seen in Minnesota, as we have in other states, governors who come in and either spend too much or take such a draconian line in cutting spending that even a surge in the economy doesn't really help them. And they remain in a kind of a deficit situation or in a really kind of crimped fiscal situation. With Arne Carlson, he positioned the state of Minnesota well to take advantage of a booming economy.
We would sit there talking about and say, well, we need another, $8 million for this, another $4 million for that. Where are we going to get it from? And I was insistent that we have a blackboard and chalk down there. I'm very old-fashioned.
Blackboard and chalk.
Blackboard and chalk. And Maury would always say, well, I'll tell you what, let's convene at 3 o'clock this afternoon and I'll come up with something. And sure enough, at 3, Maury would come down and say, okay, if we did this and transferred that over here, bingo, there, bing, there's your money.
There are a lot of people in the administration that knew a lot about the numbers in the budget. I was fortunate enough to be able to kind of study the budget really hard, know who wanted what, where all the bouncing balls were, and who was bouncing them.
By 1997, the budget deficit that his administration inherited had been turned into a $2.3 billion budget surplus. The right kind of numbers, one would think, considering re-election was right around the corner.
The expectation was, here's a guy who's doing so well, the party would be glad to ride his coattails. That was not the reaction of the conservatives. The social conservatives in particular would not support Governor Carlson. They ended up backing Alan Quist, who was a firebrand social conservative who wanted to roll back abortion and a whole number of other issues.
Mad, disappointed maybe, but determined to say, look, there's more to the Republican Party than the Alan Quists of the world. And I'm going to represent that, whether you want me to or not. He made the point that we got to have a bigger tent, and if you don't want a bigger tent, I'm going to see if I can create a bigger tent.
At the time, he had a 62% approval rating, and I watched that convention endorse Alan Quist for governor with 70% of the vote of the delegates. I couldn't believe my eyes. It didn't bother Arne one bit. He had the good fortune to run against Alan Quist in the primary, and he beat him. And then he had the good fortune to run against John Marty, who was also way out, but he was on the left, and Quist was on the right. And Arne plowed down the middle, and he was much more appealing to a large majority of voters.
Right now, I brought the rate of growth of state spending to below the rate of growth of personal income. I want local governments to do precisely the same thing.
Senator Marty, you have a plan to tax the top 4% of Minnesota wage earners and use that money for what you call ounce of prevention programs and property tax relief.
When you look at childhood immunization, I'm a parent. I know the importance of childhood health. I'm a taxpayer, and I object to the fact that we pay 11 times as much to cure childhood diseases because we failed to give $15 immunization shots.
I don't think we were really ever worried about losing that election to John Marty, but we ran as though we might lose it, and you never take anything for granted in politics.
Governor Carlson was re-elected with 64% of the vote, one of the largest landslide victories in Minnesota's history.
Politics is a very challenging business. It was thoughtful. Arne's a really smart guy. And you learn things by being around him. And I've always said it was like I got a master's degree working at state government. And that's what made it fun, because you learned something. It was effective. We won. He was very popular. He was, he could be a hoot, really, to be around.
Even though he's been gone from the governor's office for many years, he continues to be in the thick of public policy debates on important issues facing Minnesota.
I must say also that you're as vigorous and engaged on public policy as you always were, feisty as ever. Recently in your blog, you blistered the Viking Stadium deal.
Right.
You described it as a worsening boondoggle for taxpayers, perhaps hundreds of millions more than we bargained for in public subsidies. And then you noted that shelters for homeless youth are going begging for funds. Expand on that, please.
Well, I think first of all, we have to decide what kind of a country do we want to be. And when you look at all the polling, Americans by and large are dissatisfied with our direction. One, on a national level, we seem to go from one war to the next war to the next war without definition, without defined purpose. Here in Minnesota, we've been bouncing for the better part of 10 years from one deficit to the next deficit to the next deficit to the next deficit, to the dominant role of sports. And can that be brought back into better balance? The third, copper mining in northern Minnesota. I'm very deeply concerned about the ultimate contamination of Lake Superior. And certainly it's open to debate, but the point is we're avoiding all those topics. How do we intend to win global competition? How do we intend to continue to grow the economy, et cetera? So I like being engaged in public policy. Yes, I am upset by the hundreds of extra $1 million that were poured into the stadium, while the owner probably will end up with very little, if any, money in the stadium at all.
I know that you actually stood up and spoke out on the amendment to ban gay marriage for all, put it in the Constitution. You also stood up in that election in 2012 against another amendment that would have...
Voter ID.
The voter restriction amendment is way too costly. One of the things we have to do before we amend the Constitution is figure out what is it going to cost us. And sadly, the legislature did not do that. It sounds simple, but it isn't. It's very, very complicated. It will be litigated.
I think that both of those stances actually led to the chairman of the party basically excommunicating you or saying you weren't welcome at events.
Yeah, there were three of us that have met with the displeasure of the party, Al Quie and Dave Durenberger and me.
All, let's see, former governor, former U.S. senator, two former
The ones
governors.
that get elected.
His rise from the Bronx of New York City to the governor's mansion wasn't storybook or scripted in the least. It was Arne, pure Arne.
He is kind of viewed as being of the people, and he wasn't up here or over there somewhere off on a tangent, as some governors could be. And he was there working for the citizens.
And it's been a personal pleasure for me to have worked with all of you. And it was one of the greatest honors of my life to be elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives and to sit in this very chamber and to participate in the affairs of this chamber, and on occasions to make the life of a sitting governor impossible. This is a very slow audience tonight.
He should be remembered more for some of the education stuff. He should be remembered for the environmental stuff, the gay and lesbian stuff. But as time passes, there aren't going to be many of us who remember that or talk about it. He was genuinely good, and people respect that.
Arne was great in taking a position. And he would take a position after talking to a few people, but then his position was like a stake in the ground that you would tie an elephant to. He was not going to move from it. Lots of stories of the Capitol of legislators picking up their phone or running into the governor, and he would turn red in the face as he chewed them out. This was Arne's approach.
I know there are times when we present to the people of Minnesota a sense of contention and debate and disagreement. But clearly, that is precisely the essence of what democracy is about. It is the absence of dissension. It is the absence of disagreement that we should be concerned about. The fact that it exists and flourishes on this floor is something for us to celebrate.
I think Arne Carlson leaves two legacies to Minnesota. One is the stark brand of fiery independence. We have a country now that's divided between red and blue. Carlson had his own color. The other was a remarkable and consistent commitment to education.
I think he set the bar for what it is to be a good Republican governor. I think it's been very difficult for Republicans to match the standard that he set, even though I know there will be Republicans who will say, you're saying that bar was high?
But he's a person that stays involved. Retirement is not in his playbook. He gets his teeth into an issue, and with that independent streak and his honesty and integrity and value system, he goes after the things that he thinks are wrong,
Now, as a person who turned 80, I advise people never retire. Never. There's more to life than golf and fishing, although I'll get some arguments on that. No, you always have to have a purpose, you have to have a sense of value.
It's a joy to see him at work and trying to continue his efforts to make Minnesota a better state.
We will define what we believe is in the best long-term interest of the people of this state, and at the same time defines our quality of life.
That's Arne, and I love him for it.
It's the darn Arne thing.
November 8th.
I said, when you said this interview, I said, oh gosh, I better go put a tie on for this morning because Arnie's going to see something of me and he's going to want to know where the tie is.
Arne and I had and continue to have a really good friendship. And so we could air our differences without worrying that somebody was going to walk away with hurt feelings.
He has a lot of fans left at 80. Nobody was quite as involved as Arne. He makes it a point to be involved. He wants to be out there on the playing field. He wants to get his at-bats, and he wants to hit home runs.
So we're going to cover the subject area around, I think we've done healthcare pretty well.
Any calls from Hollywood yet?
There's scouts in the stands.